Chapter 8. Wait. Nightmares plagued the lonely woman, the days of solitude stretching into nearly a week. She had waited, then searched her frequented spots in the woods, and finally sat at the lake's edge, staring at her own reflection until the moon came out. The sight of it was too much now, a reminder of a girl so similar in likeness. The last wild flowers on her table had long since wilted, but she left them regardless, not daring to toss them out. She slept with the dagger under her pillow, one hand gripping the handle and stroking the crystal until her eyes could no longer stay open. Night after night, day after day. Valyn could stand it no longer on the 7th cycle. What had she to lose now? She opened the chest at the foot of her bed, dug out a wrinkled black cloak, fastened it at her neck, and pulled up the hood. The night was warm, with a slight breeze shaking the leaves and muffling the sound of any movement she may make. She left just as the moon overwhelmed the sky, slipping out of her cottage and making her way towards Setfas. Asta did not want to see Valyn, that much was clear. The woman knew the feeling of wanting to avoid people all too well, but she craved closure more than her lungs craved air. She needed to see her, one more time at the very least. Asta had been hiding something at the lake, and even if she never told Valyn what it was, perhaps a last look at the girl would abate Valyn's nightmares. Her dreams were filled with old and new memories alike, though the new would twist into unrecognizable things that would wake her with a start. The day at the lake was a frequent visitor, and that dream either did not change, or the voices won, and all Valyn would see in Asta's place was red. Over and over the memories would repeat, and Valyn felt as though her mind would snap like the twigs beneath her feet as she neared the town. She had never gotten this close to Setfas, never been near enough to clearly see the humans living there. It was strange to see a place like that, still whole instead of smoldering. Valyn wanted only the company of the elf girl who she knew was part of the nearby troop, but to find her, she needed to find the humans. Valyn began searching the outskirts of the town. The sounds around her were unnerving, so unlike those of her forest. Merriment from a tavern echoing into the night, a beggar shuffling in their sleep on the street, a cat jumping from rooftops in search of prey. Despite her unease, she would do anything to find Asta, and so she continued. Finally, she spotted a tall elven man, dressed in loose brown clothing and carrying a drawstring bag to the town. Valyn watched as he disappeared into the streets, and she traced his footsteps back to where he had come from. It took longer than expected. They had set up their camp farther from the humans than Valyn thought. The place was filled with makeshift tents, all of them still and silent in the night air. The only sound came from the crackling of a fire in the middle of their setup, the flames slowly dying. She had hoped it would be easier to tell where Asta might be, but it seemed the elves valued their sleep and did not stir for as long as Valyn sat and waited. She had waited so long, in fact, that the elf from before was approaching with his bag considerably lighter, though Valyn could hear the clink of coins within. She didn't want to speak to anyone, didn't want to let any soul know she was close to the town, but she had no other choice. Quickly, Valyn slunk over to the man, approaching him from behind until she was near enough to reach out and touch him. She lunged forward, restraining the man's arms behind his back, and pulled him behind the cover of the trees. Before he could cry out, she gripped his wrists in one hand and slapped the other over his mouth. His muffled yelling warmed her hand in a way that made her recoil in disgust, but she held fast. "Asta," she whispered harshly, "do you know of her?" The man became confused, his voice quieting a bit, though his struggling persisted. "Nod if so," Valyn ordered. In his one subtle nod, Valyn felt her whole world brighten. "Where is she?" He tried to speak, but the hand upon his mouth covered his words too well. Valyn sighed. "I will allow you to speak, but if you call for help, there will no longer be a life to save." The man nodded in understanding. Quick as a flash, Valyn removed her hand, unsheathed her dagger, and pressed it to his neck. He was silent for a moment, his body now trembling instead of struggling. "Where is she?" Valyn repeated in a hiss. The man gulped, his words stuttering and panicked. The, the cells. I'd assume. The cells? Why would Asta be there, in custody of the human guards? Nothing made sense, and it only made her temper rise. And where are these cells? He described the path to the squat building that housed the guards, stating that the cells were underground, dug into the earth long ago. Valyn listened intently, but one thing was grating on her. Why was Asta being held? Why hadn't they killed her? What did she do? Valyn asked, allowing a bit of softness in her words. I don't know, he replied, and she knew he wasn't lying. It was as good an answer as she was going to get, so she pressed her blade against the man's skin and hovered her mouth next to his ear. Tell no living soul of this meeting. In her name, I will not shed her people's blood tonight. He nodded vigorously, and Valyn let him go. He tumbled to the ground, clutching at his bag and scrambling to his feet as quickly as he could manage, before running back to his troop. Even if he did not speak of Valyn, he did not have her name, nor her face, so she decided to push her anxieties away for the night. Asta was her priority. Nothing else mattered. So, she followed the directions of the elven man, weaving between buildings and avoiding any humans who were out and about. It was a simple enough task, as the night had been growing later and later, the moon high above, as if to mock Valyn. Daylight felt so far out of reach, just like Asta. The moon would not be mocking her for much longer. The guard building was unassuming indeed, a wooden structure just as plain as the rest around it, though the door had an iron lock on it that was deceivingly intricate. It mattered not, for there was no structure and no lock on earth that could keep Valyn out. She let her magic flow from all the pores in her body, fingertips tingling and stomach roiling. The golden tendrils wrapped around her arms, legs, torso, every inch of her body. The voices rejoiced, but she would not be swayed. Not that night. She then closed her eyes and began to sink into the ground. The feeling was like floating as she became nothing, her eyes open and seeing only dirt in front of her. Her legs moved in a walking motion, but her form had no solidity, so she glided forward instead. After only a moment, she phased through a stone wall and stepped onto a dirt floor. She looked around and saw iron bars lining the space on either side of her. Some cells were empty, and some held curled-up bodies in the darkness. Valyn kept her magic around her, shielding her from the eyes of everyone but the one she wanted to see her. It did not take long to find her, even in darkness. Asta was sitting in a corner inside a cell, back resting against the wall, head dipped down into her knees, arms shielding her head. Her clothes were dirty, her hair a tangled mess, her feet bare and encrusted in dried blood. It was a sight that sent tremors of rage through Valyn, and the voices feasted upon it, like maggots to flesh. And though Valyn was silent, Asta looked up. Her face was streaked with tears as she squinted to focus on Valyn's glowing form. Once she came into view, Asta's eyes widened, her mouth agape. Before she could speak, Valyn stepped through the iron bars and into the cell with Asta. She had wanted closure, but to leave Asta there was to sentence her to death, and she would not allow it. Asta could hate her, despise her, but she would do so alive. "Come," Valyn said, outstretching a hand wrapped in gold. Asta's whole body shook at the movement, her limbs shrinking back in fear. "Please," Valyn begged. "I will not have this be the last place we see one another." The girl shut her eyes tight, taking in deep and rasping breaths. "Do what you must, but I cannot look upon you." It stung deep within Valyn, but she agreed. "All right, then." With a loving gentleness only for her, Valyn wrapped an arm around Asta's shoulders, and then another under her knees, picking her up and holding her to her chest. Asta clung to her, still shaking with eyes shut tight. The magic trembled at the contact, and the voices erupted in a chorus of jeers and pleas. Valyn's senses flaring in a madness she desperately needed to quell. Despite Valyn's very being begging for Asta's blood, begging to feed upon her life to quell her own hunger, she held tight to the girl in her arms. She walked back to the stone wall, her feet taking them into the ground beyond, and they rose to the surface. The night had almost passed, and the sun was rising steadily into the sky. Valyn tried to subdue the magic, but the voices persisted, and her own arms began to shake. No, 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 she begged them. Not her. Anyone but her. Asta released her tight grip on Valyn, urging her to let go. She did, gladly, watching as Asta blindly stepped onto the ground, wincing in pain from the wounds on her feet. Valyn wanted so badly to pick her up again, to spare her the pain, but she did not trust her own desires. Instead, she unlaced her own boots and set them on the ground next to Asta, not daring to touch her again. "I'm sorry," Valyn said softly. "Live well." She could feel her control slipping through her fingers like a snake, too agile to fully grasp. The voices would not stop, and she had no intention of being around Asta when they acted upon their wants. As she turned to leave, she felt cold skin brush against her forearm. Asta's fingertips were frigid and quivering, as though the simple brush was all she had the strength for. Valyn turned and saw that Asta's eyes were still closed, though tears managed to squeeze out, dampening her cheeks. She drew her hands to her chest, holding them there together. "Thank you," she murmured. Those 2 words were the last she had heard at the lake, and though the sound of them again still hurt, she savored them. She savored the sound of her voice, the color of her hair, the softness of her skin, all the things she had come to know and want. The memory would have to be enough. "Anything for you," Valyn responded. "Then," Asta said, "will you wait for me?" Valyn would wait 1,000 lives and 1,000,000 births of a new world for her, but she simply whispered, "Yes."